Chapter 24. The Captain's Desperation. The storm rolled in with unnatural speed, swallowing the sky in a tapestry of roiling black clouds that clawed hungrily at the horizon. Thunder cracked like the roar of some ancient beast as Seb steered his ship toward the jagged cliffs, the sea beneath them frothing in fury. Rain pelted the deck in sheets, soaking his coat and seeping through to his skin, but Seb didn't flinch. There was no room for hesitation, not when every minute counted. Alaric was locked away in the Council's dungeons, and waiting for calm weather would only cost them more precious time. The ship groaned beneath his feet as it bucked against the relentless waves, each swell threatening to capsize them. Seb's hands gripped the wheel tightly, the knuckles straining white with tension. Salt spray stung his eyes, but he refused to blink. He could see the cliffs now, towering and sharp as teeth, daring him to draw closer. Every crash of water against the hull sounded like a countdown, every gust of wind a reminder of the man he was racing to save. Alaric's face burned in his thoughts, proud, defiant, vulnerable. Seb couldn't bear the idea of him locked in chains, surrounded by people who wanted him broken. A voice tore through the wind, raw and panicked. "Captain?" Seb turned sharply to see Ren, his first mate, clinging to the railing, soaked through and pale from the cold. "We can't keep this up much longer." "The crew." His words were ripped away by the wind, but the fear in his eyes was clear. "Hold the course." Seb's voice was like iron, cutting cleanly through the chaos. He didn't care if the storm tore the sails from the masts, or if the sea tried to swallow them whole. They were going to reach the cove, or they were going down trying. Alaric had once told him he was reckless with his heart. Maybe he was right. But this time, it wasn't about recklessness. It was about loyalty. It was about love. Ren's jaw clenched with indecision, but after a heartbeat, he nodded and stumbled back into the storm. Seb didn't watch him go. He kept his eyes locked on the cliffs, guiding the ship with stubborn precision. He knew what lay beyond them, hidden by the crashing surf and the legends whispered by sailors in hushed tones. The Siren's Refuge. A place cloaked in myth, where magic still held sway and the Council's spies dared not tread. Most men avoided the place, claiming it cursed, unreachable. But Seb wasn't most men. He knew the risks, knew that sailing into that treacherous channel could mean death. But if there was even a sliver of hope, he'd take it. The refuge was one of the only places left where secrets could survive, and where allies might still remember Alaric's name with loyalty instead of scorn. The wind howled like a living thing as the ship closed the distance. Waves crashed against the cliffs with thunderous fury, but Seb saw the narrow pass opening like a mouth between two stone fangs. He steered them into it without hesitation, trusting the sea charts he'd memorized and the instincts that had kept him alive this long. This had to work. It would work. As the ship slipped into the shadow of the cliffs, the storm seemed to fall back slightly, muffled by the high stone walls of the hidden cove. Seb finally allowed himself a breath, ragged, wet, and cold. He had made it. Now came the harder part, finding those who still owed Alaric their loyalty, and preparing to tear down the walls of the Council itself. The Siren community had always been the stuff of whispered stories, legends told in taverns after too many drinks, warnings exchanged by sailors staring out into dark waters. To most, they were nothing more than cautionary tales draped in seafoam and song. But Seb had seen them with his own eyes. He remembered their beauty, haunting and wild, like the sea itself. Their voices could coax the wind to stillness and bring ships to ruin. But it wasn't their magic that drew him back to them now. It was their loyalty, fierce and unwavering for those they claimed as kin. If anyone could help him save Alaric, it was the Sirens. Still, he knew that finding them was only the beginning. Convincing them to help a human, and one who carried the weight of rebellion and betrayal on his shoulders, would be something else entirely. Seb had once walked a fine line with them, respected perhaps, but never fully trusted. Now, he would have to risk everything to prove that Alaric's cause was one they could stand behind. As his ship creaked into the shelter of the cove, the storm seemed to hesitate, its fury lessening as if unsure of trespassing further. Jagged rocks stood like sentinels at the mouth of the inlet, and Seb called for the anchor to be dropped. With a final glance at his crew, he climbed into the skiff alone. The little boat pitched beneath him, protesting each stroke of the oars as he navigated toward the slim opening between the cliffs. The waves gentled as he passed through, swallowed by silence. Inside, the air felt charged, heavy with an unseen force. It was warmer than the sea outside, carrying a faint, sweet scent that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. The lagoon ahead shimmered with unnatural light, the water glowing a soft blue-green from bioluminescent algae that clung to rocks and trailed like underwater fireflies. Seb's grip tightened on the oars as he scanned the crescent-shaped shoreline for movement. He knew they were watching. The sirens always saw before they were seen. He drifted closer to the sandbank, half expecting an arrow to hiss from the trees or the water to rise and pull him under. But it wasn't an attack that greeted him. It was a voice, smooth and melodic, slipping into his mind like silk. "Captain Sebastian," it purred, rising from the shadows between two silver-leaf trees. A figure stepped forward, her long hair glistening with droplets that caught the lagoon's glow, her eyes like shards of green glass. Seb straightened, his heart thudding in his chest as the siren approached. She was taller than he remembered, her presence commanding without needing to speak loudly. "Elandra," he said, recognizing the leader of the sirens, the one who had spared him once when others had not. "I need your help." Her lips curled in something between amusement and curiosity. "You always return with need on your tongue," she said, circling him with the slow grace of a predator. "But this time, it is not your life you wish to save. It is his." She didn't need to say Alaric's name. The knowledge shimmered in her gaze, the siren's awareness stretching further than most dared to imagine. "Yes," Seb said, refusing to flinch under her scrutiny. "He's in danger. The council means to destroy him, because he dared to build something better. Something free." His voice dropped, edged with desperation. "I don't ask this as a sailor or a rebel. I ask it as someone who owes you everything. And as someone who loves him." Seb froze, his grip on the oars tightening as the water stilled beneath him. From the jagged rocks ahead, a figure stepped forward, her presence commanding the very air around her. Her skin shimmered like pearl, catching the faint glow of the lagoon's waters, and her hair flowed in waves of silver and blue, cascading over her shoulders like liquid moonlight. But it was her eyes that held him in place, sharp, ancient, and unyielding, the gaze of a predator evaluating a trespasser. "You've come a long way to enter our waters uninvited," she said, her voice a haunting melody that wrapped around his thoughts, lovely and dangerous all at once. Though her tone was soft, there was no mistaking the warning beneath her words. Her fingers curled around a coral-carved staff, the air around her vibrating faintly with magic. Seb nodded, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I need your help," he said, steady despite the weight of her presence. "Alaric Venn has been captured by the council. If they break him, if they force him to renounce what we built, it will all fall apart. Everything we've worked toward will be lost." The siren narrowed her eyes, tilting her head slightly as if trying to gauge the truth behind his plea. "And why?" she asked. "Should that concern us? The affairs of men have brought little more than poison to our waters. We do not bleed for your wars." Her voice did not rise, yet each syllable hit with the force of a crashing tide. Seb took a breath and stepped out of the skiff, boots sinking slightly into the wet stone as he moved toward the shore. He kept his hands visible, his posture open but unwavering. "Because this isn't just about men anymore," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "The council's power grows unchecked. They silence any who defy them, human or otherwise. If they succeed in crushing this rebellion, it won't stop there. They'll look beyond the land, toward the sea. Toward you." The siren's expression remained unreadable, but the lagoon itself seemed to stir at his words, a ripple of energy passing through the bioluminescent waters. "You speak boldly," she said after a long pause. "But words are easy currency. You speak of Alaric Venn as if he is more than just another man clinging to an impossible dream." "He is," Seb replied without hesitation. "He's the only one who tried to change things, not for himself, but for everyone. He believes there's a future where your people and mine don't have to hide or fight for scraps of freedom. He risked everything to build that future. And I. His voice caught, emotion cracking the edge of his resolve. I can't let them destroy him for it. The silence that followed was thick with tension, broken only by the soft lapping of water against stone. The siren's gaze did not soften, but her eyes narrowed in thought. Then perhaps, she murmured, we should see whether your heart is as steadfast as your tongue. She turned and gestured for him to follow, her voice drifting over her shoulder. Come! The others will want to hear what you said for themselves. Another siren stepped out from the shadows, his presence no less striking than the first. His hair shimmered like strands of obsidian in moonlight, and his skin held the same luminous sheen as his companions, but his eyes were harder, glacial and unyielding. And yet, he said coolly, when have humans ever kept their promises? You speak of unity, but your kind only ever seeks to conquer. You come bearing words, but your hands are stained with the salt of old betrayals. Seb's jaw clenched at the accusation. He couldn't argue it, not fully. History had done enough to fuel the siren's distrust, and the stories of human greed and broken treaties weren't just myths whispered in fear. They were truths etched into centuries of blood and water. But that wasn't why he was here. He hadn't come to relitigate the past. He'd come to save the one man who had tried to reshape the future. I don't expect you to trust me, Seb said, forcing his voice to rise above the thundering in his chest. But trust Alaric. He's the one who believed this could work, who believed you deserved better than hiding in the depths while the surface world grew more dangerous by the day. He risked everything to protect that belief. And now I'm here, asking you to do the same for him. A heavy silence fell over the lagoon. The sirens regarded one another, their eyes flicking between Seb and the glowing waters beneath them. The stillness was unnerving, broken only by the occasional whisper of water against stone. Their silent language passed like ripples on the surface, too subtle for Seb to understand but heavy with intent. He stood motionless, letting them decide whether he would be ally or enemy. At last, the female siren, the first to speak, turned back to him, her expression unreadable. There is a price for our help, she said, each word deliberate. We do not offer aid freely, especially not to one who brings the shadow of the council to our shores. Seb straightened, his heart thudding in his chest. He had expected this. Nothing in their world came without cost, not trust, not loyalty, not salvation. Still, he met her gaze without flinching. Name it, he said. Whatever it is, I'll pay it. The male siren's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. Careful, human, he warned. Some debts bind deeper than chains, and some bargains reshape the soul. But Seb didn't look away. He had made peace with the danger the moment he'd sailed into the storm. If it took surrendering a piece of himself to save Alaric, so be it. Then let it reshape me, he said softly, so long as it brings him back. Seb's heart twisted in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. Name it, he repeated, his voice low and resolute. Whatever the cost, he had already decided he would bear it. The only thing that mattered was getting Alaric back before it was too late. Every moment wasted was another lash of suffering at the council's hand, another chance for Alaric to be broken beyond repair. The siren stepped closer, the glow of the lagoon casting strange shadows across her face. You will owe us a debt, she said, her voice like silk over steel. A life for a life. When the time comes, we will call upon you, and you will not refuse, no matter the cost. Her words hit Seb like a cold wind. He had expected a demand, yes, but not one so absolute. A life for a life. It could mean anything. A favor, a sacrifice, a death. His mind reeled with possibilities, each more grim than the last, but there was no room for hesitation. Not with Alaric's life hanging in the balance. The image of Alaric's face, pale and bruised, shackled in the council's dungeons, flared in Seb's mind. That memory anchored him. He couldn't afford to back away now, not when Alaric had stood firm in the face of betrayal and imprisonment. If this was the price, Seb would pay it. He had to. I accept, he said, the words steady even as his stomach churned. For a moment, silence settled over the lagoon like a held breath. The siren studied him with ancient eyes, measuring the weight of his choice. Then the lead siren's lips curved into a faint smile, not kind, not cruel, simply knowing. Very well, Captain, she said. We will help you. The other siren stepped forward, his arms crossing over his chest as he spoke. Do not forget this promise, he warned. Even if the world burns around you, we will come to collect. And when we do, you will answer. Seb inclined his head, accepting the threat as part of the deal. Understood. There was no turning back now. Whatever storm he had walked into, he would see it through to the end, for Alaric's sake, and for the fragile hope they had both dared to believe in. The sirens turned then, slipping silently into the glowing waters of the lagoon. Seb stood alone on the rocky shore, the weight of his vow pressing down like a second storm, darker and more dangerous than the one he just sailed through. But deep beneath it all, one thing burned brighter than fear: resolve. As the sirens began their preparations, Seb remained still at the edge of the lagoon, his boots half submerged in the glowing water. He watched as the ethereal beings moved with purpose, weaving strands of magic through the air like threads of moonlight. Their voices rose in haunting harmony, a song older than any human language, resonating deep in the bones. Though he didn't understand the words, the weight of them pressed against his chest, a solemn promise of power and cost. The lagoon pulsed with energy, the bioluminescent glow intensifying until it shimmered like liquid starlight. Mist coiled over the surface, swirling in patterns that defied wind or tide. One by one, the sirens slipped into the water, their forms disappearing beneath the surface as they summoned the ancient spell. Seb could feel it working, feel the shift in the world around him. It was as if the very air grew heavier, filled with tension, with magic. Seb clenched his fists at his sides, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon beyond the cove. Somewhere out there, across seas and stone walls, Alaric waited. Whether he still held out hope or had surrendered to despair, Seb didn't know. But he could not allow himself to imagine failure. He had to believe Alaric was holding on, that he still believed in him. That belief was the only thing keeping Seb from unraveling under the weight of his choices. He had made a deal with creatures born of ocean and myth, sworn to a debt that might one day claim his life. But regret held no power over him now. Seb had lived a life of risk and fire, and he would not flinch from the flames this time. Alaric had once saved him from the edge of ruin, pulled him from the wreckage of his own destruction, and shown him something worth fighting for. It was his turn to return the favor. As the spell reached its peak, the waters began to part. A spiral of sea foam and light opened in the center of the lagoon, revealing a hidden path that plunged downward into the depths. The song of the sirens faded into a single, sustained note, vibrating through the air like a held breath. Seb stepped forward, his heart pounding with fear and determination in equal measure. The lead siren surfaced again, her silver hair streaming like kelp around her. The path will not remain open long, she warned, her voice softer now, almost reverent. At its end lies the old current, the river beneath the council's keep. Follow it, and you'll surface within their walls. But beware, Captain. Magic cannot protect you once you arrive. Seb gave a short nod, his expression grim. I don't need protection. Just the way in. He stepped into the spiral, cold water rising around his legs as he moved deeper. Every step was a promise, to Alaric, to the cause, to the soul he had just bartered for a chance. With one last glance at the sky above, Seb inhaled and dove beneath the surface. The spiral closed behind him in a hush of silence, and the lagoon returned to stillness, save for the echo of a vow made in shadows and light, in love and desperation. Chapter 25. A Dangerous Escape. The council's stronghold loomed like a jagged wound against the night sky, its towers and battlements rising from the cliffside like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. Rain slicked the stone, and thunder rumbled in the distance, but Seb paid it no mind. He crouched in the shelter of a weathered buttress, his breath slow and deliberate. The shimmer of siren magic still clung to him like a second skin, but he could feel it weakening, thinning like morning mist. Every second he lingered brought him closer to discovery. He had to move. Clutched in his palm was the vial, no larger than a thumb and glowing faintly with aquamarine light. It pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, humming with restrained power. The sirens had been clear. The magic within was potent, but limited. One misstep, one careless use, and the gift would be spent. Seb cradled it with the care of someone holding fire, beautiful, dangerous, and essential. He breathed through the rising anxiety, focusing only on his goal. Alaric was here, somewhere in the stone belly of this monstrous place. He would not leave without him. He scanned the high wall ahead, its surface slick and uneven but climbable. Just beyond, a guard tower overlooked the outer courtyard. Seb waited in perfect stillness as a sentry paced the ramparts above, counting each step, each pause. Then, in a flash of movement, he darted across the exposed courtyard, his boots finding silent purchase on wet stone. He pressed himself into the curve of an arched doorway, hidden in shadow, listening for any signs of alarm. None came. So far, so good. Once inside, the atmosphere changed. The keep's interior was colder, darker, airless, and stale like something long entombed. Water dripped from the ceiling in rhythmic plinks, echoing down narrow, winding halls carved from the same oppressive gray stone. Seb moved with purpose, recalling each turn of the map burned into his mind. The dungeon lay beneath the eastern wing, deep below the council chambers where judgments were made and fates decided. That's where they'd put him. That's where they'd put Alaric. A sudden flicker of light warned him, torch fire, and with it, the soft clink of armor. A guard. Seb slipped into a crumbling alcove, one hand already on the vial. As the soldier drew near, Seb uncorked the container and whispered the phrase the sirens had etched into his mind. The glow erupted softly, bathing the hallway in blue light for the span of a breath. The guard faltered, blinked, and then slumped soundlessly to the floor, eyes glassy and unfocused. Seb caught him before he hit the ground and eased him down, careful not to disturb a single buckle or weapon. Hard hammering, he moved on, deeper into the fortress. The magic was already beginning to fade, the shimmer around him dulling, his movements feeling heavier with each step. He couldn't rely on it much longer. But the door he sought finally appeared, reinforced iron, banded with rusting steel, flanked by two torches whose flames barely flickered in the stagnant air. No guard stood outside, which was either a sign of arrogance or confidence. Either way, it made Seb's job easier. He slid a pick from his belt and knelt beside the heavy lock. Sweat dripped from his brow as he worked, the tumblers inside reluctant but not immune to coaxing. After a tense moment, there was a soft click. Seb exhaled slowly and pushed the door open just wide enough to slip inside. The room was pitch black, save for a single barred window high above that let in a sliver of moonlight. A shadow moved in the far corner, tall, slumped, chained. "Alaric," Seb whispered, stepping forward. The figure stirred, and a voice answered, rough but unmistakably his. "Took you long enough." Seb caught the guard's falling body with practiced precision, his arms strong but gentle as he eased the man to the cold stone floor. He paused, listening for any sign of disturbance, but the only sound was the distant rush of the storm outside and the faint drip of water from the ceiling. The vial in his hand pulsed weakly, its magic slowly fading. The shimmering aura around him dimmed, a cruel reminder that he couldn't rely on it much longer. He needed to act quickly, or risk being caught in the fortress's depths, trapped with no way out. The dungeon air grew colder as Seb moved deeper into the bowels of the stronghold, the dampness clinging to his skin and biting into his bones. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, amplifying the silence around him. The walls, slick with moisture, seemed to press in on him, as if the very stone were trying to swallow him whole. Every drip of water that fell from the ceiling sounded like a countdown in his mind. He kept moving forward, his eyes darting between the shadows, heart thudding in his chest. His mission felt increasingly impossible, but the thought of Alaric kept him moving, kept him focused. After what seemed like an eternity, Seb finally arrived at the heavy iron door marking the entrance to the high-security cells. The door loomed in front of him like an unyielding barrier, its surface pocked with rust and the scars of time. A thick, rusted lock secured it shut, the kind that could withstand any normal attempt to break in. Seb's pulse quickened as he approached. This was it, the final obstacle. He could feel the weight of every second slipping away. Without hesitation, Seb reached for the slender pick on his belt, the small tool cold in his hand. He knelt before the door, his mind narrowing to the task at hand. His hands, though slightly trembling from the adrenaline coursing through him, worked quickly and efficiently. He could hear his breath steady as he carefully maneuvered the pick, listening for the delicate click of the tumblers as they gave way. His concentration was absolute, his mind blocking out all but the lock. After several agonizing moments, the final tumbler fell into place, and the lock released with a quiet snap. Seb winced as the door creaked open, the hinges groaning in protest. The sound was like a thunderclap in the silence, but he forced himself to move. His body tensed as the door swung inward, revealing the dark, narrow hallway beyond. The faint glow of torchlight flickered from the far end, casting long, shifting shadows against the stone walls. Seb's eyes quickly scanned the row of cells, each one colder and more oppressive than the last. The scent of mildew and damp stone hung thick in the air. The prisoners within were mere silhouettes, their faces hidden in shadow, their forms slumped against the walls. He took a tentative step into the dim corridor, his breath slow and shallow. He didn't dare make a sound, though his heart was hammering in his chest, thumping with urgency. The cells stretched on either side, and for a moment Seb felt a flash of doubt. Had he come this far only to fail? But then, in the farthest corner, his eyes caught the familiar form of a slumped figure, half hidden in the shadows. His heart clenched in his chest. "Alaric," Seb whispered, his voice barely a breath in the stillness of the dungeon. The name felt foreign in the space, weighted with all the fear and hope he'd been carrying for what seemed like an eternity. His eyes locked onto the figure in the corner, hoping, praying, that it was really him, that this wasn't some cruel illusion. The image of Alaric, bound and broken, was enough to steal his breath away. The figure stirred slightly at the sound of his name, a faint movement in the otherwise still air. Seb's heart leapt, but he didn't move forward just yet. He needed to be sure, needed to see those eyes that had once looked at him with fierce defiance, now possibly dulled by the weight of captivity. He couldn't bring himself to reach out, not yet. But in that fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition, of hope, seemed to pass through the shadows. The figure stirred, a faint shift of movement in the shadows, and then Alaric's face emerged, pale and drawn, the sharp contours of his features more pronounced in the dim light. His skin seemed almost translucent, the darkness beneath his eyes a stark contrast to the pallor of his face. The raw marks of the iron shackles around his wrists were visible, crimson and inflamed, but it was his eyes that caught Seb's attention, those eyes, once so full of fire and challenge, now flickering with something deeper. Despite everything, despite the pain, those eyes burned with defiance. "Seb?" Alaric's voice rasped from his dry throat, hoarse and cracking, as if he hadn't spoken in days. His words held disbelief, a sharp edge of astonishment threading through the single syllable. Seb felt his heart seize at the sound of his name, but he couldn't afford to dwell on the emotion, not now. The urgency of the moment was like a tightening noose around them both. Seb moved without hesitation, his boots scraping quietly on the cold stone floor as he crossed the distance between them. He kneeled before the cell door, his eyes never leaving Alaric's strained form. "Hold on. I'll get you out of here," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. The determination in his tone wasn't just for show. It was the only thing holding him together in the face of everything they'd been through. He reached into his belt and pulled out the slim lockpicks, his fingers trembling only slightly as he set to work on the stubborn lock. His mind raced even faster than his hands, calculating every potential obstacle, every risk they still faced. "The council won't be distracted for long," Seb muttered under his breath, his movements precise but quick. "We have to move fast. Time was slipping through his fingers like water, and every second felt like a heartbeat too many. Alaric's gaze softened as he looked at Seb, his eyes flickering with a mixture of relief and something darker, concern, maybe guilt, but it was fleeting. He shifted slightly in his position, though the chains around his wrists kept him mostly still. "You shouldn't be here," Alaric murmured, his voice a low rasp that sent a wave of discomfort through Seb. The words were more than just a warning, they were a plea, an attempt to push Seb away from the danger. And yet, there was no hiding the undercurrent of relief in Alaric's tone. He was glad to see him, even if it meant putting Seb at risk. Seb didn't hesitate, his focus entirely on the lock. His hands worked faster, the subtle click of the tumblers falling into place reverberating in his ears. The words didn't register right away, but when they did, Seb's jaw tightened. Alaric always had a way of downplaying the situation, of making it seem like there was still time to think, to prepare, to retreat. But this wasn't the time for caution. They had already crossed the line. There was no turning back now. "I'm here because I will get you out," Seb replied, his voice low but firm, tinged with a quiet anger. He didn't know how, didn't know if they'd make it out alive, but he would move hell and earth if that's what it took. The thought of Alaric, his friend, his comrade, someone he cared for more than he wanted to admit, left in that cold, dark cell was unbearable. He wasn't going to let the council win, not like this. As the final piece of the lock clicked open and the door creaked inward, Seb reached out, his hand hovering briefly over Alaric's shackled wrists. He didn't wait for an invitation. There was no time to waste. Seb gently gripped the cold metal of the shackles, using the leverage of his own strength to break them apart. The sudden release of pressure made Alaric's shoulders sag slightly, his body suddenly able to shift with more freedom, but the exhaustion in his face was evident. Even as the shackles fell to the floor with a dull clank, Seb could see the toll the imprisonment had taken on him. The weight of the last few days was written all over his pale face. "Like hell I wouldn't come for you," Seb shot back, his voice tight with the emotions he had been trying to keep in check. The words were more than just a response, they were a declaration. His heart pounded as he fought to keep his focus on the task at hand, but the rawness of the situation crept in. The thought of Alaric, locked away in that forsaken cell, left to wither under the council's control, ignited a fire in Seb's chest that only grew hotter the more he thought about it. "You think I'd let them keep you here to rot?" he continued, the words leaving his mouth with a fierce certainty. There was no way in hell he was going to let that happen, no matter what it cost him. The lock finally gave way with a sharp click that echoed in the silence of the dungeon. Seb wasted no time. He pulled the heavy iron door open with a grunt, the rusted hinges protesting as they creaked under the strain. Alaric staggered to his feet immediately, the motion jerky and uncoordinated as though his body had forgotten how to move freely. For a moment, he swayed on unsteady legs, his face contorting in discomfort as he tried to steady himself. Seb's breath caught in his throat for a second, his mind screaming at him to move faster, but Alaric's condition was a harsh reminder of how close they were to failure. "Easy there," Seb muttered under his breath, stepping forward to catch Alaric before he could lose his balance completely. His hand shot out instinctively, his grip firm around Alaric's arm as he braced him, feeling the weight of his friend leaning heavily on him. Alaric's body felt frail, almost fragile, like he had been broken down by days, or weeks, of suffering. Seb's stomach churned at the thought, but there was no time to dwell on it. They had to move. Now. "Can you walk?" Seb asked, his voice low but tinged with urgency. His gaze was locked on Alaric's face, watching for any sign of weakness that would make him hesitate. They didn't have the luxury of time. Every moment spent in the dungeons was a moment that brought them closer to being discovered. The council wasn't known for their tolerance of betrayal, and Seb was certain that their escape wouldn't go unnoticed for long. Alaric's response came in a hoarse murmur, the exhaustion in his voice unmistakable. "Barely," he admitted, his words trailing off with a wince. It was enough to make Seb's heart clench with frustration. He wanted to do more for Alaric, to ease the burden of his pain, but they had to keep moving. There was no room for delays or hesitation. "Good enough," Seb replied sharply, his voice steady despite the flood of emotions rushing through him. He had no time for pity, no time for weakness. They were in this together, and if Alaric couldn't stand on his own, then Seb would bear that weight for as long as it took to get them out. Seb looped Alaric's arm over his shoulder, using the added support to help steady him. The motion was practiced, a seamless transition into a new rhythm as they began to move toward the exit. The two of them moved slowly at first, Alaric's weight dragging them down, but with each step, Seb's resolve grew stronger. The narrow corridor felt like it stretched on endlessly, the walls closing in as they pushed forward. Seb's muscles burned with the strain of holding Alaric up, but he refused to stop. They couldn't stop. Not now, not when they were so close to getting out. As they moved deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the dungeon, the silence between them felt heavier, laden with unspoken words. Alaric's presence beside him was both a comfort and a reminder of the danger they were in. Seb could feel his breath ragged against his neck, could hear the faintest hitch in his friend's breathing, but he didn't dare look over. Alaric wasn't the same as he had been before. He was broken, a shadow of the man Seb had fought beside. But that was something Seb couldn't afford to think about right now. They had to get to safety, and then, only then, could they afford to deal with the consequences of their actions. The journey out of the dungeon felt like an eternity, each step heavy with the weight of their situation. Alaric's injuries were more than just physical. They were a reminder of how much they had risked to get this far. Every movement he made seemed to drain him further, his body visibly struggling to keep up with the pace Seb was setting. Seb's own muscles screamed in protest from the strain of supporting Alaric, but he couldn't afford to falter. The damp, cold air in the dungeon made everything feel more oppressive, and each creak of the floorboards under their feet sounded like a thunderclap to Seb's frazzled nerves. His senses were on high alert, the silence of their escape amplified by the pounding of his heart. The further they moved through the labyrinthine hallways, the more exposed they became. Seb's every step felt like it was echoing off the stone walls, amplifying their presence, but he kept pushing forward. Twice, they were forced to duck into the shadows, pressing themselves into alcoves and waiting in the suffocating silence as the sounds of the guards' footsteps grew louder. Seb's breath hitched every time, his grip tightening around Alaric as he held his position. It was impossible to ignore the way his own pulse quickened, each moment spent hidden in the dark raising the stakes higher. The vial in Seb's hand was growing lighter with each use of the magic. Its glow was dimming, its potency fading, and Seb could feel the effects waning with every passing minute. The siren's magic had granted them an edge, but it wasn't an unlimited resource. Every time he used it to incapacitate a guard or create a path forward, the magic seemed to burn through faster, leaving him with fewer options. He couldn't risk being caught before they reached the exit. The pressure of the dwindling magic weighed heavily on him, the knowledge that one wrong move could spell their capture and, worse, Alaric's life. Finally, they reached the outer corridor, the thick stone walls of the keep opening up to a larger passage that led toward the outer gates. Seb felt a flicker of hope surge through him. They were close now, so close he could almost taste the freedom beyond those gates. His hand tightened around Alaric's arm as he guided him forward, his eyes scanning the area ahead for any sign of danger. The air felt a little fresher here, less stale, but it didn't do much to alleviate the tension that gripped Seb's chest. Every step was a reminder of how precarious their escape was, and how easily it could all fall apart. But as they rounded a corner, the sound of a shout rang out behind them, sending Seb's heart into his throat. His blood ran cold as the word echoed through the halls like a death knell. "Escape!" the voice shouted. Seb's eyes widened in realization, and a curse slipped from his lips. The guards had discovered their absence. They had been too slow, too careless. The noise was enough to set the alarm off, and Seb could hear the sound of boots pounding against the stone floors as the chase began. The weight of that realization hit him like a tidal wave, and his body immediately went into overdrive. They weren't just running for freedom anymore, they were running for their lives. "Run!" Seb barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. There was no room for hesitation, no time to second guess. He yanked Alaric forward with a surge of desperation, urging him to move faster. Alaric's limp body seemed to falter against him, but Seb refused to slow down. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder, closer, and Seb's heart raced in sync with the pounding of the guard's pursuit. The adrenaline coursing through his veins drowned out all else, sharpening his focus on the only thing that mattered: getting out of there. Seb's mind was a blur of thoughts and commands as they rushed down the corridor. Every corner they rounded, every shadow they passed, was fraught with danger. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his instincts screaming at him to move faster, but his eyes always returned to Alaric's strained form. Seb's breath came in short, harsh bursts, his body slick with sweat despite the cold, but there was no time to stop. He couldn't afford to. The closer they got to the outer gates, the louder the shouts and footsteps behind them became. The council's forces were closing in, and the odds of escaping without a fight were rapidly diminishing. As they neared the entrance to the courtyard, Seb's pulse spiked, and he knew they were nearly out of time. The walls of the stronghold seemed to close in around them, pressing in with an urgency that made his chest tighten. But then, just as they neared the final stretch, a blast of cold air rushed in, and Seb knew they were almost there. With Alaric's weight still leaning heavily on him, Seb pushed forward, his mind focused on nothing but that final stretch of freedom. The sound of pursuit grew louder, but Seb didn't dare look back again. He could feel the weight of the world bearing down on him, but he refused to stop running. They weren't dying here, not today. They sprinted, or stumbled in Alaric's case, through the winding halls of the stronghold, the sound of boots pounding behind them like a relentless drum. The adrenaline coursing through Seb's veins was the only thing keeping him moving at full speed. He could feel the weight of Alaric leaning heavily against him, his injured body unable to keep up with the urgency of their flight. Every time Alaric's foot faltered, Seb's grip tightened, pulling him forward. Their breath came in ragged gasps, mingling with the deafening thud of their footsteps, and the further they ran, the more Seb felt the weight of time pressing down on him. The guards were getting closer. He could hear their shouts growing louder, and each second felt like it could be their last. When they finally burst into the courtyard, Seb wasted no time. His hands trembled, but he yanked the vial from his pocket and threw it down with all his strength. The impact of the vial shattering on the stone ground sent a burst of light into the air, and a thick mist erupted from it, swirling around them like a living thing. The guards who had been hot on their heels faltered, their cries of confusion rising in the fog. The mist cloaked their movements, hiding them from view as they bolted toward the outer gate, their steps quick and frantic. Seb didn't dare look back, focusing entirely on the path ahead. The mist would give them a few precious seconds, but he knew it wouldn't last long. As they reached the final stretch toward freedom, Seb felt the mist beginning to thin, the heavy air dissipating as the guards regrouped behind them. His heart pounded in his chest, urging him to push faster. But just as they neared the open gate, a figure appeared in front of them, blocking their path. A guard, his blade drawn, stepped forward with the intent to stop them. Seb's mind went into overdrive, and without thinking, he ducked low under the swing of the sword. The blade whistled through the air, narrowly missing his shoulder. In that split second, Seb's body acted on pure instinct, driving his shoulder into the guard's chest. The man grunted, and with a loud thud, he was knocked to the ground, his weapon skittering across the stones. "Keep going!" Seb shouted, his voice filled with urgency. He didn't wait to see if the guard would recover. There was no time for hesitation. Without breaking his stride, he dragged Alaric through the gate, forcing him forward with all the strength he could muster. They were so close now, but the danger was far from over. Seb's muscles burned with the effort, and his mind raced with the knowledge that the council's forces would be right behind them. Every step took them further from the keep, but it also drew them closer to the perilous cliffs that lay ahead. The storm from earlier had returned in full force, the rain coming down in sheets, pelting them from all sides. The cold water soaked through their clothes in seconds, making their bodies slick and heavy. Seb could barely see through the deluge, but he didn't need to. He knew the way. The cliffs loomed in the distance, their jagged edges cutting through the darkness like silent sentinels. Seb's ship was anchored just beyond the rocks, but the distance between them seemed insurmountable. as if the sea itself was trying to keep them from their escape. The wind howled, tearing at their clothes, and Seb could feel the tension in the air, as though nature itself was conspiring against them. "Stay with me, Alaric," Seb murmured, his voice barely audible over the storm. He could feel Alaric's weight sagging against him more with each step, the injury and exhaustion clearly taking its toll. But Alaric's grip on him tightened, a silent affirmation that he was still with him, still fighting. The sound of pursuit faded behind them, but Seb knew it wouldn't be long before the guards regained ground. Every instinct told him to move faster, but with Alaric's injuries slowing them down, he had to balance the need for speed with the urgency of keeping his friend conscious and on his feet. As they neared the base of the cliffs, Seb's heart skipped a beat when he spotted the outline of his ship anchored in the distance, its sails flapping wildly in the wind. It was their only chance at escape, but the last leg of the journey felt like an eternity. The water surged beneath them, dark and foreboding, as if mocking their attempts to flee. Seb's mind raced with the terrifying realization that they might not make it. His ship was anchored, yes, but it was still a far stretch from the shore. The cliffs were treacherous, the rocks sharp and unforgiving. But there was no other option. He had to get to that ship. "Almost there," Seb whispered, more to himself than to Alaric. The sound of the rain was deafening, but Seb pushed forward, knowing that every second counted. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged bursts. There was no room for failure now. As they reached the narrow strip of beach at the foot of the cliffs, Seb knew they were running out of time. The storm made it difficult to see much beyond the shore, but he could make out the dim outline of his ship just beyond the rocks. It was their last hope, and he wasn't going to let anything stop them from reaching it. But as they stumbled closer to the water's edge, a shadow moved at the top of the cliffs, catching Seb's eye. A guard, silhouetted against the stormy sky, had appeared at the edge of the rocks, watching them with calculating eyes. Seb's pulse quickened. There was no way they could outrun him now. The storm, the exhaustion, and the near-complete depletion of his strength all weighed on him, but he couldn't stop. Not now. With a final burst of energy, Seb hoisted Alaric forward, determined to reach the ship before the guard had a chance to alert the others. The sound of pursuit was fading into the wind, but the fight was far from over. They were almost there, almost free. Behind them, the shouts of the guards grew louder, sharper, and more frantic, echoing through the night air. Seb's heart raced, each beat pounding with the urgency of the situation. His breath was ragged, his body screaming from the exertion, but he didn't dare slow down. Alaric, his injured body nearly limp in Seb's arms, had all but lost consciousness. His grip on Seb's shoulder was weak, but there was still a faint pulse of life, a flicker of awareness that Seb clung to. They had come so far, but the end was still so far away. "Almost there," Seb muttered under his breath, though it felt like a lie, a cruel hope clinging to the edge of desperation. Every step felt heavier than the last, the rocky shore beneath their feet slippery from the relentless downpour, the air thick with the scent of salt water and rain. Seb's muscles burned, his arms aching as he struggled to keep Alaric upright, urging him forward. The darkness of the cliffs pressed in from all sides, and the crashing waves below seemed to mock them with their endless rhythm. The sound of the guards' pursuit was growing louder, more determined. Seb's mind raced, plotting out every possibility, but there were no other options. The cliff's edge was in sight now, their last barrier before freedom. But as Seb reached the precipice, the sight that met him made his stomach twist with dread. He turned to look over his shoulder, and the sight of the guards' torches flashing in the distance sent a chill down his spine. Their figures, silhouetted against the stormy sky, were closing in with alarming speed, their shouting voices carrying on the wind. The torchlight bobbed like erratic fireflies, growing steadily brighter. Seb's pulse quickened. The distance between them was closing too fast, and it was clear the guards wouldn't let them escape without a fight. His eyes flicked to the skiff below, the small boat bobbing in the tumultuous waters, its single mast swaying with the violent waves. The moment they were spotted, they would be trapped. Desperation clawed at Seb's chest, tightening like a vice around his heart. There was no time left. He couldn't risk being caught now, Not after everything they had endured. His hands shook as he grabbed Alaric by the waist, hoisting him up the edge of the cliff with what little strength he had left. The wind whipped around them, cold and unforgiving, as the rain lashed down harder, blurring his vision. With a grunt, Seb finally managed to haul Alaric into the skiff. The boat rocked violently as he shoved Alaric down onto the seat, then scrambled in himself, barely managing to keep his balance as the waves threatened to capsize them. Without a second thought, Seb yanked the rope securing the skiff to the rocks, his hands slick with rainwater. The moment the rope came free, the small boat lurched violently in the waves, as if the sea itself were reluctant to let them go. Seb's heart hammered in his chest, his thoughts a whirlwind of panic. The skiff rocked wildly, threatening to spill them both into the churning sea, but Seb's grip on the oars was ironclad. With one powerful shove, he forced the boat away from the cliff's edge, his eyes on the distant horizon. The boat pitched again as the current grabbed hold of it, pulling them out into the open sea. The wind howled, slashing against their faces, but Seb didn't flinch. The storm had returned with a vengeance, the waves crashing against the skiff with relentless force, pushing them further out into the night. His muscles screamed from the strain of keeping the boat steady, but he didn't dare let up. Alaric, still barely conscious, slumped against the side of the boat, his chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. Seb's eyes never left the shore behind them. The guard shouts were still faintly audible in the distance, but with every passing second, the current carried them farther from the cliff, from the fortress, from their enemies. The sight of the cliff edge, the last landmark of their desperate escape, was fading into the darkness. Seb's hands trembled, not from fear but from the sheer exhaustion coursing through his body. He had pushed himself beyond his limits, but they were not out of danger yet. He could feel the weight of the storm in the air, the sea surging beneath them as if it were a living entity, guiding them or threatening to swallow them whole. The skiff, though small and fragile, was their only lifeline now. It would carry them into the unknown, but the question of whether they would survive was one Seb wasn't ready to answer. Behind them, the sound of the guard's pursuit had faded, the once urgent shouts now mere echoes swallowed by the storm. Seb's breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the journey pressing down on him like an anchor. They had made it past the greatest hurdle, but there was still the vast, unpredictable ocean between them and safety. He couldn't allow himself to relax, not yet. The storm was a threat in itself, a reminder that the sea, like everything else in their world, was just as dangerous as it was their salvation. Seb's eyes flicked to Alaric, his friend and ally, who lay pale and exhausted in the boat, and for the first time since their escape began, Seb allowed himself a breath of relief. As the current carried them farther out, Seb forced himself to focus on the horizon, where he knew the ship waited, his last hope of keeping them both alive. The boat creaked in protest as it rocked with the waves, but Seb knew it wouldn't hold for long. They had to reach the ship, and they had to do it quickly. With every passing moment, the distance between them and the land grew, but so did the distance between them and their pursuers. The storm's howling winds seemed to drown out everything else, and for the first time, Seb allowed himself to think about what they had accomplished. They had made it out of the Council's stronghold, they were alive, and they were still fighting. The rest, he would leave to fate. Seb collapsed onto the bench of the skiff, the damp wood pressing against his back as he took in a deep, ragged breath. His body felt like it was made of lead, every muscle protesting with exhaustion, but it didn't matter. He cradled Alaric's limp form in his arms, the weight of his friend's unconscious body grounding him, keeping him tethered to the reality of their narrow escape. Alaric's breathing was shallow, his face pale from the strain of the journey, his wounds still not fully tended. Seb's fingers trembled as they brushed over his friend's skin, the flicker of life still present but fragile. They had made it out, but the cost had been high, and Seb knew that the path ahead would be even more dangerous than the one they had just left behind. The weight of their escape settled heavily on his chest. The Council would not let this transgression go unanswered. They had made too many enemies during their fight for freedom, and the forces that sought to crush their rebellion were not ones to forgive easily. Seb's thoughts raced, every possibility of retribution flashing through his mind, each one darker than the last. The idea of the council's wrath was enough to send a cold shiver down his spine, but there was no time to dwell on it. For now, he could only focus on the present, on the fact that they were still alive, still breathing, and that, for the moment, was enough. As the skiff rocked gently in the open sea, Seb's gaze shifted toward the horizon. The land they had just fled was now a distant silhouette, its shores slowly being swallowed by the darkness of the night. A thick fog had rolled in, masking the stars above, but the fading outline of the cliffs served as a reminder of how close they had come to being caught. A flicker of relief washed over him, fleeting as it was, and for a brief moment Seb allowed himself to exhale, to release the tightness in his chest. They had done it. They had escaped the council's stronghold, and no matter what happened next, that was an accomplishment worth acknowledging. But it was only a moment. Seb knew better than to think they were safe. The storm that had followed them seemed to mirror the storm within him, a constant churn of unease, of uncertainty. The sea around them was vast, uncharted in many ways, and though they had eluded their pursuers for now, there were no guarantees they would remain free for long. The council's reach was long, and Seb could feel the weight of their power pressing down on him even now. His thoughts turned to the future, to what came next, but the answers were elusive. For the moment, there was only survival. And survival meant keeping Alaric alive, getting them both to safety. Seb's gaze flicked to the unconscious form of Alaric, his breathing steady but slow. His mind raced with worry. What if the damage from the council's torture was too much? What if Alaric didn't recover? Seb's hand gently brushed the back of his friend's head, pushing the wet strands of hair away from his face. Alaric had been a symbol of defiance, of strength, and Seb could not afford to lose him now. The thought of continuing this fight alone, of bearing the weight of the rebellion on his shoulders without Alaric's strength beside him, was almost unbearable. But Seb knew he couldn't afford to falter. Not yet. The wind shifted, the waves growing more restless as the storm churned the sea beneath them. Seb's heart thudded in his chest, the rhythmic beat a stark contrast to the chaos of his thoughts. His eyes scanned the horizon again, searching for any sign of the ship, for any sign of safety. But all he saw was darkness, the unknown stretching out before them like an endless abyss. He could feel the storm in his bones, the weight of their escape settling over him, but the danger was far from over. They had eluded the council for now, but what about the next wave of threats? What about the dangers that awaited them once they reached their destination? There was no comfort in knowing they had made it this far. The battle was far from over, and Seb's instincts screamed at him to stay alert. He couldn't let his guard down, not with Alaric so vulnerable, not with so much on the line. The stakes had always been high, but now they felt higher than ever. Seb's mind churned with plans, with contingencies, but there was nothing concrete he could hold on to. He had made his deal with the Sirens, but the debt they had extracted loomed over him like a dark cloud, a constant reminder that no victory came without its price. The skiff continued to rock with the waves, and Seb found himself staring out into the endless sea, unsure of what awaited them next. The weight of their escape pressed on him, but it was the weight of what came after that truly gnawed at him. He had to keep fighting. He had to keep moving. For Alaric, for their cause, for everything they had sacrificed. He couldn't let this be the end. Not when they were so close to something greater, something worth fighting for. Seb's hand tightened on the side of the boat, his knuckles white. They had escaped, but the true battle was just beginning. Chapter 26. A Fateful Decision. The air inside the Siren Council's chamber felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on Alaric. The ethereal glow of the crystalline walls cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the floor, distorting the faces of those who watched him. Each council member sat in high-backed chairs, their forms imposing and otherworldly, radiating an ancient, unspoken power. Their eyes, glowing with the eerie light of the ocean's depths, fixed on him with a chilling intensity. Some seemed intrigued, while others displayed clear contempt, their disdain palpable. Alaric could feel their gaze like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders, but he refused to let it break him. He had faced worse than this. He would face worse again, but for now, he stood tall, resolute in his defiance. His wrists, still raw from the shackles he had been forced to wear in their prison, ached with every movement. The iron was gone, but the invisible chains of expectation that the council had wrapped around him were even heavier. The exhaustion from his ordeal, both physical and emotional, gnawed at him, but he kept his back straight. He had come here for a reason, and he wasn't about to let their judgment break his resolve. He had made his choice, and now he would answer for it. The faintest tremor in his hands was the only sign of the inner turmoil he felt. He had fought for survival, for those he loved, and for the future of both their worlds. But here, in this chamber, in front of the council, it all seemed insignificant in the face of their judgment. At the center of the council sat Liara, their leader, as ancient as the sea itself. Her presence was commanding, a woman whose very voice seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Her eyes glowed with the deep, knowing blue of the ocean's depths, and when she spoke, her voice filled the room like the crash of waves against the shore. She was the embodiment of their power, their history, their unyielding will. Alaric's breath caught in his throat as she addressed him, her words sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade through water. Alaric, then, you have been brought before us not as a captive of the land, but as a son of the sea who has strayed too far into the world of men. The words hung in the air, their weight heavier than anything Alaric had imagined. He had always thought of himself as a bridge between their worlds, the sea and the land. He had fought to protect both, to ensure a future where neither side was left to suffer under the burden of fear or hatred. But now, standing here before the council, his thoughts seemed fragile, as if they were being pulled under by an overwhelming tide of doubt. He had never truly considered himself an outsider, not until now. Not until Liara's words cut through him with the truth he hadn't wanted to face. In their eyes, he had crossed a line, and no justification would be enough to erase the consequences of that decision. Liara's gaze never wavered from him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she spoke again, each word dripping with condemnation. You broke the council's decree. You allied yourself with a human, jeopardizing the secrecy and safety of our kind. Her words lashed at him, and he could feel the heat of shame rising on his cheeks. He had known the consequences of his actions. He had known the council would not take kindly to his defiance. But hearing it from Liara, hearing it laid bare in the silence of the chamber, made the reality of his choices far more painful. The repercussions of your choices have rippled far and wide, she continued, her voice gaining strength. You have drawn the attention of forces that could destroy us all. Her words sank into his chest like a weight, each one adding to the burden he already carried. Alaric had known the risks when he chose to fight alongside Seb, when he chose to trust the human who had once been his enemy. But he had never fully understood what those risks meant for his people. Now, standing before the council, he realized just how far his choices had sent ripples through the waters. The stakes had always been high, but now, with the council's gaze locked on him, the enormity of what he had done became impossible to ignore. He had put everything at risk, the safety of his people, the future of their kind, and for what? For a fleeting hope that a human might be different. A fleeting hope that the world could change. Alaric clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the pulse of defiance surge within him once again. Despite the weight of their judgment, despite the harsh truth of their words, he would not be broken. He had made a choice, and he would not regret it. His alliance with Seb, his fight for a better future, was not something he could simply undo, not even for the council. He had chosen this path, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. I stand by my actions, Alaric said, his voice steady, though the words were heavy in his throat. I did what I believed was right. For our future, for the future of both our peoples. Liara's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line as she considered his words. The silence in the chamber stretched, thick and suffocating. The council's gaze flicked between one another, their expressions unreadable, their judgments forming in the shadows of their minds. Alaric could feel their eyes on him like an ocean pressing against a fragile shore, testing whether he would break, whether he would apologize, whether he would recant. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. He had made his choice, and he would face whatever came next with the strength of that conviction. There was no turning back now. Finally, Liara spoke again, her voice softer, though no less resolute. Your actions have consequences, Alaric Ven, and you will face them. But understand this, the Council's wrath is not the only threat you will face. The tides of history are shifting, and you, too, will be swept along with them. Whether you are ready or not. Her words were a warning, a promise, a curse, all wrapped into one. And as Alaric stood there, in the face of their judgment, he understood that the true battle had only just begun. Alaric's mouth hung open as if to speak, to argue, to plead, but Liara's raised hand stopped him cold. The room, vast and cold, seemed to close in around him, the weight of her authority pressing down on him like the deep, crushing waters of the ocean. The Council's eyes remained fixed on him, their silent scrutiny like an invisible current, pulling him deeper into the unspoken verdict they had already decided. His pulse quickened, a storm of emotions rising within him, but he couldn't even formulate a single word in his defense. He had known it would come to this, but hearing it aloud made the reality of it even more unbearable. Liara's voice, calm yet filled with unyielding strength, sliced through the tension. You will not deny the truth of this, she said, her words resonating with the force of the ocean itself, unmoving and undeniable. But we are not without mercy. There was something chilling in her tone, as though she was granting him a small favor by not condemning him outright, as if she were offering him a thread to cling to. We understand the complexities of the world above the waves, and we are prepared to grant you a choice. Her words made his stomach twist, and a knot of fear lodged deep within him. His heart pounded faster, each beat louder than the last. He had feared this moment, though he hadn't dared to name it, not until now. The Council's mercy was nothing more than a shadow of hope, one that threatened to crush him just as much as their wrath would. The choice she spoke of was not a choice at all. It was a trap, a game of power that pitted his love for Seb against the very essence of who he was. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand something more, anything more, but no words came. His chest tightened as Liara's cold eyes bore into him, holding him in place with their unspoken power. Sever your bond with the human, Captain Sebastian, Liara continued, her voice unflinching, and you will be welcome back among your people. Each word landed with the heavy weight of a sentence, a promise that came with a cost far greater than anything Alaric had imagined. The flicker of hope he had clung to faded, replaced by a rush of guilt and uncertainty. He felt like a prisoner once more, shackled not by iron but by the very love that had led him to this moment. Your mistakes will be forgiven, and your place here restored. It sounded like an offer, but it was a bargain wrapped in chains, freedom with a price too steep to bear. Alaric's mind reeled, but his body remained still, unwilling to betray the hurricane of emotions that roiled inside him. The words swirled around him, crashing over him like the waves that sought to drag him under. His heart, torn between two worlds, clenched painfully in his chest. To return to his people, to be accepted again, meant severing the bond he had formed with Seb. It meant choosing duty over love, loyalty to the Council over the human who had become so much more than a fleeting ally. And yet, the weight of his connection to the sea, to his people, tugged at him, begging him to choose them over everything else. But could he? Could he truly betray everything he had come to feel for Seb? Liara's gaze never wavered, her eyes like twin pools of dark water that saw too much, understood too much. Her voice, though calm, carried an undeniable edge of finality. Refuse, and you will be cast out, exiled from the sea and all it holds. The words hit him with the force of a tidal wave, crashing through any last remnants of defiance he might have harbored. Exile. The very thought of it, the endless, cold expanse of the surface world, the betrayal of his people's ancient ways, sent a chill through him. The sea was all he had ever known, and to be cast away from it would mean losing himself entirely. The Council's decision was final, as unyielding as the tides that governed their world. Alaric could feel the weight of their judgment, a force that felt as certain and immutable as the ocean itself. There was no room for negotiation, no space for compassion. It was as if his very existence hinged on this choice, on which side he would fall. And yet, the choice itself seemed impossible. To choose Seb would mean turning his back on everything he had ever known, on his duty to his people, to the ocean. To choose the council's decree would mean abandoning the one person who had shown him that there was more to life than duty and obligation, that there was love, even between two worlds that seemed destined to remain apart. He wanted to scream, to refuse them all, to demand something different, but the words stuck in his throat. This wasn't a negotiation, and he knew it. His body trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the turmoil inside. His thoughts flashed to Seb, his strength, his warmth, the way they had come together against impossible odds, and a sense of guilt washed over him. How could he choose the council, choose his bloodline, when Seb was the one who had shown him what it meant to live beyond expectations? How could he turn away from the one person who had seen him, truly seen him, without the weight of his title, his lineage? The silence in the chamber stretched on, oppressive and unbearable. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, waiting for him to make his choice. To bend or break. To surrender or fight. His heart pounded painfully in his chest as the moments slipped by, each one heavier than the last. The council would not wait forever. Liara's gaze remained fixed on him, unblinking, her expression a mask of unreadable judgment. And Alaric, torn between two worlds, between two loves, found that he was no closer to finding an answer than when he had first stepped into the chamber. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the glowing walls that surrounded the council's chamber. Alaric stood there, the weight of the decision pressing on his chest, feeling the tension in the air like an invisible current. His mind raced, flashes of memories colliding with the present, each one a wave crashing relentlessly against the rocky shore of his thoughts. He saw Seb's face, heard his laugh, rough and unpolished yet genuine. A sound that had once been a comfort, a promise of something more. The way Seb's eyes softened when they were alone, the vulnerability there, as though he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders but found solace in Alaric's presence. That memory of their first kiss, the warmth of Seb's lips against his, the tenderness that spoke louder than any words ever could, sealing their bond in a moment that felt eternal. It was impossible to forget. And now, it was all at stake. The council's gaze was unyielding, their presence like a looming shadow that made his thoughts feel small, insignificant in comparison. Alaric's heart thudded heavily in his chest as the silence stretched on. He knew what they wanted from him, what they had always wanted. Complete loyalty, unquestioning devotion to the sea and to his people, no matter the cost. But in the quiet of that chamber, as the weight of their expectations crushed him, Alaric knew that his heart had already made its choice, even if his mind struggled to reconcile it. He had come too far to ignore the truth that had settled within him. His connection to Seb was not just a passing moment, a fleeting attraction. It was something deeper, something that had become as essential to him as the very water that surrounded them. After what felt like an eternity, Alaric finally found his voice, steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I cannot sever what was never meant to be broken," he said, each word a declaration, a refusal. He met Liara's gaze, unwavering despite the conflict within him. To say the words aloud was to acknowledge the depth of his feelings, the irreversible truth of what had blossomed between him and Seb. There was no going back from this. He would not, could not, betray the bond they shared, not for the council, not for anything. The thought of severing it was unthinkable. It was not a choice, it was an impossibility. Liara's eyes narrowed, and the air grew colder, heavier with the force of her judgment. "You would choose exile over loyalty to your people?" Her voice was sharp, as if the very suggestion of such a betrayal had struck her like a physical blow. "You would betray your own kind for a fleeting connection to a mortal man?" Her words sliced through the air, each one a condemnation, a judgment that carried the weight of centuries of tradition and expectation. It was clear that she saw Alaric's defiance not as a matter of love or personal choice but as an affront to everything they had built, everything they had fought to protect. Alaric bristled at her words, anger rising within him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He could feel the heat of her disapproval, the sharp sting of her accusations, but he would not let them shake him. It is not a betrayal to follow my heart, he said, his voice firm. He could feel his pulse quicken, but he didn't look away from Liara. You see Seb as a threat, but he has risked his life to protect me. To protect us. He understands the value of this world, even if he was not born to it. There was a fire in Alaric's words, a conviction that burned brighter with every passing second. He had seen Seb's heart, his willingness to fight for something greater than himself, and Alaric would not allow anyone to dismiss that as weakness or folly. The council members remained silent, their eyes unreadable as they processed his words. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of centuries of tradition and duty pressing down on Alaric's shoulders. He had always known the council would never understand, would never accept his choices, but that didn't matter anymore. The sea had always been his home, but the connection he had found with Seb, this man from the world above, was something beyond the council's reach, beyond their narrow understanding of loyalty and duty. It was real, and it was something worth fighting for, even if it meant standing alone against the very forces that had shaped his entire life. Liara's gaze shifted slightly, her expression shifting from anger to something colder, more calculating. And you believe this human, she began slowly, her words deliberate, can be trusted with the secrets of our kind? That he will protect our way of life? Her tone was laced with doubt, as though the very idea of Seb understanding the true weight of their existence was laughable. To Liara, the human world was something foreign, something dangerous that could never comprehend the intricacies of the sea and its people. But Alaric knew better. He knew Seb's heart, and he knew that Seb would fight to protect it, just as Alaric would fight for Seb. Alaric's resolve hardened as he met Liara's gaze once more. Yes, he said, his voice steady and certain. I believe in him. And I believe in us. His words hung in the air, defiant and unyielding. In that moment, Alaric realized that he no longer feared the council's judgment, nor did he fear the consequences of his choices. The world above and below the waves were no longer separate in his mind. He had come to understand the fragility of both, and in that understanding, he had found the courage to stand firm. He would choose Seb, and he would choose the life they could build together, no matter the cost. The sea had given him life, but it was love that had given him purpose. And that was something he would never surrender. Another council member, a stern-faced siren named Kale, leaned forward. You speak of understanding, but can a human truly grasp the depths of what we are? They are creatures of land and time, bound by their mortality. Their lives are fleeting, their promises brittle. How can you stake your future on such a being? Alaric met Kale's gaze without flinching. Because he has already proven his worth. His actions speak louder than any words ever could. The council erupted into murmurs, their disapproval crackling like distant thunder. Liara raised her hand, silencing them once more. Your decision is clear, then, she said, her voice cold. You choose the human over your own kind. Alaric's chest tightened, but he nodded. I choose the bond we share. I choose the path that feels right, even if it costs me everything. Liara's expression hardened, and for a moment, Alaric thought he saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes. So be it. From this day forward, you are no longer one of us. You will walk the land as an exile, your connection to the sea severed. Another council member, Kale, a stern-faced siren with piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through to Alaric's very soul, leaned forward in his seat. The expression on his face was unreadable, his sharp features like carved stone, unmoved by the weight of Alaric's words. You speak of understanding, Kale began, his voice low and cutting. But can a human truly grasp the depths of what we are? They are creatures of land and time, bound by their mortality. Their lives are fleeting, their promises brittle. How can you stake your future on such a being? The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring Alaric to provide an answer that would justify his choice. Kale's gaze never wavered, the judgment in his eyes as unyielding as the sea itself. Alaric's heart pounded in his chest, but he met Kale's gaze without flinching. The council's doubts, their scorn, meant little to him now. What mattered was the truth he carried in his heart. Because he has already proven his worth, Alaric said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. His actions speak louder than any words ever could. The weight of those words was undeniable. Seb had proven time and again that his commitment to Alaric, to their bond, was unshakable. He had risked everything, sacrificed everything, just as Alaric had done. They understood each other in ways no one else could. In the face of danger, of betrayal, Seb had never wavered. That was what mattered to Alaric. That was what he would stake his future on. The council erupted into murmurs at his declaration, the sound crackling like distant thunder, low and ominous. The disapproval radiated from them, thick and suffocating. It was clear they saw only weakness in his words, a betrayal of the sea and all it represented. Their voices blended into a single, dissonant roar, each syllable a reminder of how far Alaric had strayed from the path they had set for him. Liara, who had been silent up until now, raised her hand, and the room fell into an uneasy quiet. Her authority was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed down on all who stood before her. When she spoke, her voice was cold, as if the air itself had grown colder with her words. "Your decision is clear, then," Liara said, her tone clipped and precise, as though she were speaking to a child who had disappointed her. "You choose the human over your own kind." The words were like a slap, sharp and painful. They stung Alaric, reverberating through him, each one a reminder of the rift he had created. But even as the council's judgment fell on him, Alaric did not falter. He had made his choice, and he would not be swayed by their condemnation. They would never understand, never see the truth that lay between him and Seb. That truth had nothing to do with the council's narrow view of loyalty. It was something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of land and sea. Alaric's chest tightened at the weight of Liara's words, the finality in her tone, but he stood tall, his resolve hardening like stone. He could feel the gaze of the entire council upon him, heavy and suffocating, but he did not look away. He had walked this path alone for far too long to turn back now. "I choose the bond we share," he said, his voice unwavering. The words felt like a declaration of war, a stand against everything he had once believed in. But it was the truth. He had found something in Seb that the sea had never given him. The council would never understand, but that was not his concern anymore. "I choose the path that feels right, even if it costs me everything," Alaric continued, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. His heart raced with the weight of his decision, but there was no hesitation in his voice. He had made this choice not out of defiance, but out of love and conviction. It was a path that would lead him away from everything he had known, from everything the council had taught him to value. But it was a path that felt truer to him than any other. The sea had given him life, but Seb had given him a reason to live, a reason to fight. Liara's eyes narrowed, and her lips pressed into a thin line as she absorbed his words. There was no fury in her gaze, only an icy, implacable disappointment. "Then you have sealed your fate," she said, her voice low and dangerous, like the calm before a storm. The finality in her tone sent a chill through Alaric, but he stood firm, his shoulders squared as though ready to face the consequences of his actions. He had known this moment would come, had known the price he would have to pay. But the choice had been made, and there was no turning back. For a moment, no one spoke. The council seemed to regard Alaric as though he were a fool, a child who had wandered too far from the shore. Cale's expression was unreadable, his eyes still locked on Alaric with the cold detachment of a predator. The rest of the council remained silent, their judgment clear in the stiff lines of their faces. But Alaric did not look away. He had made his choice, and he would stand by it, no matter the cost. The air in the chamber felt thick, oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in on him. But as Alaric stood there, surrounded by the council's cold silence, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The sea had always been a force of nature, unpredictable and powerful, but it was not the only force in his life anymore. Seb had taught him that love, trust, and loyalty could be just as powerful as any storm. And now, Alaric would face whatever came next with the knowledge that he had chosen the right path, the path that was true to his heart. Even if it cost him everything, he would not regret his decision. The words hit Alaric with the force of a physical blow, each one reverberating in his chest as though they had struck his very soul. Yet, despite the pain they caused, he refused to let it show. His expression remained composed, his posture unwavering. He had learned long ago how to mask his emotions, how to bury his vulnerability beneath a hardened exterior. But inside, a storm was brewing. The weight of the council's condemnation pressed heavily on him, the sting of their rejection lingering in the air. The sea, his life's constant companion, seemed distant now, as though it had turned its back on him. Liara, her presence commanding the room, stood slowly, her robes flowing around her like dark waves crashing against the shore. Her eyes were cold, unfeeling, but there was a finality in her gaze that sent a chill down Alaric's spine. "You are dismissed," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of authority, the force of a decision that could not be undone. Her words were sharp, like the edge of a blade, and they cut deep. "Leave this place and do not return." It was a sentence, a command, and Alaric knew there was no arguing with it. No second chances. No mercy. The path he had chosen had led him here, to this moment of irreversible loss. Alaric turned on his heel, his movements slow but deliberate. Each step he took away from the council felt heavier than the last, the finality of their judgment hanging over him like a cloud he could not escape. The echoes of his footsteps were the only sound in the chamber, as he walked toward the exit. The heavy doors loomed ahead, their dark wood a silent reminder of the place he was leaving behind. When they swung shut with a resounding thud, the sound seemed to seal his fate. The finality of it was suffocating, and for a moment, Alaric stopped just outside the doors, breathing in the stillness. He had been cast out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The corridor was empty, the silence oppressive. As Alaric walked further down the stone passageway, he felt the weight of the decision pressing on him, the echoes of Liara's voice still ringing in his ears. The walls seemed to close in around him, the once familiar halls now strange and distant, like a dream fading away. His mind was consumed with thoughts of what he had lost, the council, his people, his place in the world. But then, as he reached the outer door and stepped into the open air, the sea greeted him with a roar. The salty wind whipped at his face, sharp and invigorating. It felt like a reminder that, despite everything, he was still part of the world. The world that he had fought for, the world that had never truly turned its back on him. Outside, the sea stretched endlessly before him, an expanse of dark water and swirling waves. The horizon seemed to go on forever, as though it held no end. The sight of the ocean filled Alaric's chest with a bittersweet sense of longing. He had once been a part of this world, a son of the sea, but now that connection felt fractured, broken by the very people who had once been his family. His gaze wandered over the crashing waves, each one coming and going, a reminder that the world would continue to turn, with or without him. It was a thought that should have been comforting, but instead, it left him feeling empty. He walked slowly to the edge of the rocky outcrop, his boots scraping against the uneven stone beneath him. The wind tugged at his hair, pushing it back from his face as he stood there, staring out at the vast expanse of the ocean. The waves crashed against the cliffs below, a mournful symphony of sound that seemed to mirror the turmoil in his heart. Alaric's mind drifted to Seb, to the man who had been his anchor in a world that was now slipping through his fingers. Seb had never asked for any of this, but he had stood by Alaric through every trial, every hardship. And now, Alaric was determined to do the same for him, no matter the cost. The weight of the council's decision still pressed on Alaric's chest, but in the quiet of the sea air, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had lost so much, the trust of his people, the life he had known. The future he had once envisioned now seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars. But as his thoughts turned to Seb, to the love they shared, Alaric felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. It was a small thing, but it was enough to keep him going. Seb was out there, waiting for him, and that thought alone was enough to propel him forward. Alaric closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the waves wash over him, the wind biting at his skin. He had been cast out, exiled from the only home he had ever known. But he was not truly alone. He had Seb, And with him, Alaric felt a sense of belonging that no council, no decree, could take away. Seb had shown him that love could transcend boundaries, that connections could be forged even in the face of overwhelming odds. And Alaric had no intention of letting that go, not now, not ever. The sea had always been his constant, but now, Alaric realized, it was no longer just the ocean that defined him. It was the bond he shared with Seb, the choices they made together. The future was uncertain, yes, but with Seb by his side, Alaric believed they could navigate whatever storm lay ahead. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something that could not be measured in the same way as the past. And as Alaric stood on the edge of the cliff, the wind at his back, he allowed himself to feel that glimmer of hope. It was small, but it was enough to carry him forward into the unknown.